And so the next day, I bought a one-way ticket to Nepal. I had no idea what Nepal was, or where it was, or what language they spoke, or anything. I just knew that that's where I needed to be. So I went to Nepal and ended up spending a year overseas, living in the temples of Nipponzan in Nepal and India, Sri Lanka, Cambodia. I did a walk in Cambodia. And the temple where I stayed the longest was Lumbini, helping with the construction of the pagoda. And the schedule at that temple was we would start morning prayer would start at 5 in the morning. So prayer from 5 to 7, breakfast from 7 to 8, construction work from 8 to 5, prayer from 5 to 7, dinner from 7 to 8, and then we'd have a couple hours to take a shower, wash our clothes, and then go to bed, and then start it all over the next day. And I was like that 7 days a week. Breakfast was the same thing every day. Lunch and dinner were the same thing, so we literally had 2 different meals, 7 days a week. And I look at it now, and I don't know if I could live that lifestyle now, but at that point in my life, it's exactly what I needed. You know, within 6 months, I went from staying up all night getting high partying to this temple life, and it was exactly what I needed. It taught me discipline, you know, it taught me the importance of hard work, and it taught me the importance of a concept in Japanese called shugyo, which is a word that there's not a great translation for in English. Shugyo is kind of a combination between practice and training, but it's like a spiritual practice. There's a deeply spiritual component to me. You know, when people talk about they have a meditation practice or a martial arts practice, they're talking about shugyo. And it's something that you train yourself to get to a larger goal in life. And the construction work there involved me picking up a plate of wet concrete, putting it on a cushion in my head, walking up 3 flights of stairs, dumping the concrete, going back down, getting another plate, and we do this all day. And it was, I mean, it's crazy to think about it, but it was one of the best times of my life because I was there practicing shugyo. I just recently returned from Japan. Had the honor of being invited to go out there and do some work by an organization called Byakko Shinkokai. They're the ones that started the Peace Bowls. If anyone's seen Peace Bowls, that's their thing. And another practice that they have are these mandalas that they draw. They write mantras like "May peace prevail on earth," write that over and over and over again in small, tiny writing until it fills this beautiful image. And one of the men that I was in Japan with wrote some reflections about his trip later on. And he said that, you know, when you write something like that over and over and over again, and you're meditating on that over and over and over again, what does that do to the mentality of the person that's doing that over and over and over again? And the idea of shugyo, oftentimes you end up doing something over and over and over and over again. In Nipponzan, they chant Nammyo Horenge Kyo over and over and over again. Martial artists, they practice certain moves over and over and over again. And so that idea of training, that deep training of shugyo became really important to me with my time at Nipponzan. And it's also something that is really important within the philosophy of Kingian Nonviolence. Kingian Nonviolence is something that grew largely out of the Nashville student lunch counter sit-ins, where Dr. Bernard Lafayette was one of the student leaders there. Diane Nash, John Lewis, many leaders of the civil rights movement grew out of the Nashville movement. And sometimes people ask, how come so many important leaders grew out of that one small movement in Nashville? And it's largely because of their commitment to training. Reverend Jim Lawson was leading nonviolence trainings in Nashville for those leaders, and they trained for an entire year before they engaged in their first protest. And that's what made them so successful, and that's what allowed them to become leaders in other movements throughout the civil rights movement after that. And so within Kingian Nonviolence, the idea of training, that social change is not going to come easily. And if we're really going to create peace, then we need to be committed to the idea of training to the same level that soldiers are committed to training their troops. Right? If people are training their soldiers for 6-month boot camps to go to war, then we need to at least be committed to the same level of creating peace. That nonviolence is not easy, and we need to be trained in social change. It's just not going to come easily. So Kingian Nonviolence, you know, we're going to be doing a 90-minute workshop later on today. Our introductory workshop is usually 2 full days, and it's 16 hours with homework. And our organization, we don't even call those trainings anymore. It's an introduction into a philosophy in which you can be trained in, and if you would like, that training starts at the end of those 2 days. The level 1 certification to become a trainer in this is a 2-week training of like 14-hour days. And even then, people don't feel comfortable. A lot of people don't feel comfortable at the end providing this training because it's deep stuff. Right? I used to think nonviolence was easy, that it was just about turning the other cheek. And I realized that it's so much more than that. After I got back from Asia, I was overseas for a year. After I got back, I started working with an organization called the Peace Development Fund. It's a progressive social justice foundation. I ended up there for just over 10 years. And it was a really unique foundation in that even as a philanthropic organization, even as a foundation, we were exploring models of philanthropy in which the relationships that we build with our grantees were not based on the money that we give away. So as a financial institution, our main work was to give grants. So how can we build relationships that weren't based on the grants that we give away? Because we believe that and if we're trying to create social change, then relationships just can't be based on money alone. And so one of the initiatives that I coordinated at the time was called BASE. It's Building Action for Sustainable Environments. And Pete, who I bumped into for the first time in about 6 years, yeah, he's all the way back there. I met him through BASE. He was directing an organization called the Shundahai Network at the time. And BASE was a national coalition of 16 communities that lived around some chain of the nuclear cycle. So we had organizations that lived near uranium mines, research facilities, storage facilities, production sites, all the way down to the waste facilities, so that we could see the impact of the nuclear cycle in each link of that chain, and bringing all those communities together so that they can see how their local struggles is tied to a much larger issue. And one of the challenges with BASE was that we brought together rural black communities from Mississippi with native communities from the reservations in the Southwest, with farm worker communities in the Northwest. So there were a lot of cross-cultural dialogues, and we needed to learn how to work together between cultures. And peace is a messy process, right? It can get really messy, and so BASE got really messy at times. And we would also, similar to the Middle Passage Walk, spend hours arguing with each other. And I remember one time we were at a meeting in Little Rock, Arkansas, and there was a reverend named Reverend Jenkins from Aiken, South Carolina. And she stood up and said, I realized after all these arguments that we've had over the years that in my community in South Carolina, in the church community, if I spent more than a couple minutes to introduce myself during group introduction activities, that would be considered disrespectful because I'd be taking too much time. But I now know that in some native cultures, if you don't spend a half an hour to introduce yourself, that's considered disrespectful because you're not sharing enough about each other. And she said that I realized that a lot of conflicts that we have between cultures is just a simple misunderstanding or a lack of acknowledgement about each other's value systems. That if we just sat down and got to know each other's cultures a little bit better, that a lot of what we assume as conflicts and cultural clashes that has a tendency to escalate and end up in arguments, they don't have to be that. And so I actually want to pause right now, and I want to encourage you to turn to one of your neighbors, perhaps somebody that you don't know, and I just want to offer 5, 6, 7 minutes for you to talk about a time when perhaps you can remember you've had a clash with somebody based on different cultural understandings, different cultural values. It doesn't have to be in a movement context, although anyone who has been through Occupy maybe has some experiences with that. But I also, I was in a long-term relationship once with a woman from Mexico. And we used to always have these clashes, and she used to always say, when we weren't arguing, we would laugh about it, that, I was this stereotypical, stoic, unemotional Japanese male, and she was this stereotypical, fiery, emotional Latina, and we would always have these clashes, and it was a challenge at times. So I want you to turn and just for a few minutes, just have a conversation about a time that you may have experienced some clashes based on different cultural values, and if you got through it, how you were able to get through it. So just a few minutes. Thank you all for engaging with each other. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn from conflict. Conflict is like we say, it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing. It's something that we can learn a great deal from. And in the Peace Development Fund, I experienced a ton of conflict, and I learned a ton from it. And there's a conflict in the fact that some people want to take 2 minutes to introduce themselves, and others want to take 20 minutes. But oftentimes the argument begins when we start making assumptions about each other's cultural values and what's the right way to do something. When again, when we really sit down and talk to people, perhaps there's not that much of a conflict, but something new that we can learn about each other's cultures and each other's ways of being. So the 10 years that I spent in PDF, filled with conflict, but it's, again, another experience that I would never trade in, because I learned to be with so many different types of people. And in late 2008, early 2009, there were 2 incidents that happened that, again, changed my life forever. There's been several things that have happened throughout my life that completely changed my life. The first happened in November of 2008, when I took my first 2-day workshop in Kingian Nonviolence. Kingian Nonviolence is a philosophy that I like to think of it as it was given birth on the morning of April 4th, 1968. And early that morning, Dr. King was in his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was having a conversation with Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was at the time the national coordinator of the Poor People's Campaign. And they were talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and Dr. Lafayette had to go to Washington, D.C. to attend to a press conference. So as he was leaving his hotel room, Dr. King called out to him and said, "You know, Bernard, the next movement that we need to have is to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence." Dr. Lafayette said he kind of didn't know what King meant by that, but he figured that they would just finish that conversation later on. He had to catch a plane, so he said, "All right, King, Dr. King, we'll talk about this more later," and he took off. And unfortunately, they were never able to finish that conversation because just about 5 hours after that conversation, Dr. King was shot. So Dr. Lafayette then took that as Dr. King's final marching orders to figure out a way to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence education. And over the years, he worked with another guy by the name of David Jensen to create this philosophy, this training curriculum called Kingian Nonviolence, as a way to institutionalize and internationalize the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King and the organizing strategies used in the civil rights movement. Now, this philosophy has gone around the world at this point, to Nigeria, to Colombia, to Israel, all over the United States, working in schools, working in prisons, working in community institutions, working with law enforcement, as a way to embed the practices and the philosophies of nonviolence as part of the day-to-day practices and operations of different institutions. The second thing that happened was about 3 months after that workshop. When I took that first 2-day workshop, I told Globe, who was the trainer at the time, the founder of PPWN, I told him that this philosophy is stuff that I always knew, that I just didn't know how to articulate. And so this philosophy was just so alive in my head when on New Year's morning of 2009, a young man by the name of Oscar Grant was shot and killed by the transit police in Oakland, California. Many of you probably have heard his name before. There's actually a movie called Fruitvale Station about the last 24 hours of his life that's about to be released. But Oscar Grant was a young man, African-American man, 22 years old, father of a 2-year-old girl named Tatiana, who was out partying on New Year's Eve with some of his friends in San Francisco. About 2 o'clock in the morning, New Year's morning, he was taking the train, the BART, back to his home of Hayward, coming through Oakland. And on the train, he got into an altercation with another group of young men, him and his friends. And so the BART police, the transit police were called, and the train was stopped at the next station, which was Fruitvale Station, about a mile from where I live. And at one moment, the police had, taken Oscar and all his friends out onto the platform, and they were questioning him. And there was a moment where Oscar was being held down, laid down on the ground, his stomach on the ground, with one police officer holding him down using his knees, while another police officer stood up, unholstered his gun, and shot him in the back. And this happened right on the train platform on New Year's morning. So there were hundreds of witnesses, and many of them caught the whole incident on their cell phones. And the videos got uploaded to YouTube, and the whole thing just went viral. And I ended up on the steering committee of, we called it the Coalition Against Police Executions, which was the community coalition that was behind organizing a lot of the rallies and the community's response to it. And throughout that movement, I realized that even in movements for peace and even in movements for justice, there's many different ways in which we can engage in that work. And the Oscar Grant movement, I mean, at that time, it had so much potential. You can ask anyone who lived in Oakland during the first few months of 2009, and just the raw emotion that was present in the entire city, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. You could go on BART, go to the laundromat, go to a cafe, everyone's talking about Oscar Grant. We could have called meetings with the mayor, with the chief of police, with the BART president, and they would have had to meet with us. So it was a movement, it was a moment in history that had incredible potential. But in my opinion, we let it go to waste. And in my opinion, in my perspective, it was because even though that movement had so much potential, it was a movement that was largely grounded in anger and grounded in hatred towards the police. We hated Johannes Messerly, who was the police officer that shot Oscar Grant. We hated the police. And on the one hand, we have every right to be angry, right? I mean, we need to be angry about these situations. And at the same time, I remember during one of the rallies, the rallies were always peaceful, right? It was always when the rallies ended and it got dark that there was violence. For those that don't know, there was, if you want to call it rioting or uprising or whatever, there was violence in the streets of Oakland for a while. People were burning police cars, breaking windows. And I remember one time after one of the rallies, some young black men from East Oakland started breaking windows at a Wells Fargo bank. And so me and a few other people ran up. As they turned, there was another bus station that was in one of those glass bus stations, and they tried to break the window, so we got in between them to try to stop them from breaking the window. And I just remember seeing the anger in the eyes of these young people and just how frustrated they were and how fed up they were with the system and with the violence that they had to witness every single day of their lives. And that night, I was at a friend's house, and we were talking as CAPE about how we were going to respond to the violence, especially with the media, right? We were running press statements, and we had a press conference the following morning. And ultimately, we decided to distance ourselves from the violence. Said, we organized a peaceful protest. Let's focus on that. We had nothing to do with the violence. And I felt a little uneasy about that. And later on, I realized it was because, again, the young people were right to be angry. Were they right to break windows? No, I disagree with those tactical decisions. But they have every right to be angry. And I realized that as a community, we need to create spaces for a lot of these young people, safe spaces for them to be able to release their anger. Because if they don't have safe spaces to release that anger, it's going to get released in the streets. Whether it's during a protest or during gun violence that happens every single day in East Oakland, it's going to get released somewhere. So we need to honor that anger, recognize that they're angry for a good reason, and find ways to help channel that anger. Anger can spark movements. Anger has sparked many movements, but it cannot sustain movements. If anger becomes the driving force behind a movement, we eat ourselves up from inside out. And that's exactly what happened with the Oscar Grant movement, right? We started arguing with ourselves, and we started accusing each other of working with the police or of not being there for the movement or for the right reasons, and we just destroyed ourselves from inside out, right? I mean, we destroyed just as many movements as that. We always like to point the finger and say, oh, it's the FBI, it's COINTELPRO, and those are legitimate too. We know that. But we also destroy just as many of our own movements because we can't learn how to relate with each other within our movements. This is one of the reasons why it's sometimes frustrating for me. Well, let me preface this by saying I personally have a meditation practice. I try to practice meditation as often as I can. The East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland is one of my favorite places in the world. So meditation has been a really important practice for me personally, and at the same time, there's a lot of organizations that come into places like Oakland and go into the schools and teach kids meditation practices and breathing exercises to control their anger. And those types of organizations, like if that's all they do, it's a little frustrating for me. Because we can teach kids to meditate, And that is one piece of the puzzle. And if we're not acknowledging why these kids are angry in the first place, they can meditate every single day of their lives, and if their best friends are getting shot up, if their family members are getting locked up, right? If they're witnessing violence and drugs every single day as soon as they step outside their front doors, meditation is not enough. I was in some of the jails, I talked to a lot of young people, and they say that in our community, if you're 25 years old, you're considered an OG. You're considered an elder in their community at 25 years old. All right? In Oakland a couple of years ago, we had 2 5-year-old kids and a 1-year-old baby shot and killed in drive-bys. I went to a detention school in Selma, Alabama once, ironically called Phoenix. And they had kids from ages 13 to 17 that had been thrown out of other schools. And they just throw these kids, regardless of age, into one room and sit them in front of a computer all day. And so the youngest kid was 13 years old. At 13 years old, society had already given up on this kid. And we wonder why kids are angry. And we tell them to breathe, right? And it's just, we need to be working for peace not just in Afghanistan and not just in Israel and Palestine, but in the streets of East Oakland and in the south side of Chicago and in East St. Louis and in over the Rhine in Cincinnati and Watts in LA. Because there are wars being waged in our own backyards that sometimes we don't acknowledge. And it sometimes feels safer to work on issues in Afghanistan. And not to say that that's not a huge piece of the puzzle, right? In fact, more people need to be working to end wars overseas. And we need to be more committed to the inequities at home. There was another time I was at a high school in Chicago, and we were doing a week-long training in nonviolence, and there was a young woman who got a text during the middle of our training, text message that her best friend was shot up. And so we obviously put the training on hold for a minute, and we circled up and sang some songs to acknowledge what she was going through. And one of the teachers said, there's neighborhoods even in the city of Chicago where kids are not getting shot up every day. Like what you all experience in your neighborhood, in North Lawndale, is not normal. And there's neighborhoods even in Chicago where this is not normal. And one young woman who was a sophomore at the time stood up and she said, "What?" And she actually started arguing with us. And that's not true. This is how it is everywhere. And I realized that the violence that she witnesses every day of having to bury so many friends by the time she's 15, 16 years old is so normal for her that she couldn't even comprehend that things could be different or that things are different in other neighborhoods because it's all she's known. Now that young girl is now one of the student peace warriors at North Lawndale College Prep High School. This high school over the last 4 years has seen a 90% reduction in violence, led by the student peace warriors. And that follows a 70% reduction in violence just in the first year after they institutionalized Kingian Nonviolence. In 1 year, 70% reduction. And that to me is evidence of the 6th principle of Kingian Nonviolence. In Kingian Nonviolence we have 6 core principles, the final one being that the universe is on the side of justice. That school, the teachers and the administrators of that school decided to invest in peace and decided to invest in their young people. And those are the returns that they got. And sometimes, people during the trainings, they say, well, how can you tell me that the universe is just when there's so much violence in the world? And I tell them that I've come to see every time a young person gets shot in the streets of Oakland, I see that as evidence of this principle. Because look at all of the investments that we make into violence as a society. Right? We continue to invest in war. We continue to invest in a broken prison system. We continue to invest in broken schools. And then somehow we act shocked when we see violence and injustice in our communities. Maybe if we invested more into peace, then the same justice of the universe will ensure that we'll start to see some of those returns. Right? So fighting for justice in some of the hardest hit communities has to be part of the peace movement. Right? Sometimes the peace movement we think of as the anti-war movement, it's all over there. But the wars overseas are manifestations of the injustices at home. Right? Dr. King said about the Vietnam War that we're sending young black men to fight for rights in Southeast Asia that they don't have in Southeast Georgia. Like, what sense does that make? King was also very critical of a lot of pacifists and a lot of pacifist organizations, because Dr. King believed that oftentimes pacifism, people misunderstand the true meaning of pacifism, that it's just about sitting at home and singing Kumbaya and hoping that the war overseas ends, without looking at what's happening in our own backyards and without having the righteous indignation about what's happening overseas as well as at home. He said that true pacifism isn't about non-resistance to evil, but it's about active nonviolent resistance to evil. Very different things. It's not enough to sit at home and sing Kumbaya. It's not just enough to hope that different people can learn to get along, but we need to be angry. Right? Our message to kids isn't don't be angry, because we need to be angry about the fact that kids are getting shot up. We need to be angry about how much investments we're making into war. We need to be angry about poverty. The question is what we do with that anger. Right? The theme of this conference is harnessing outrage and compassion. So what does it mean to harness anger in a healthy and productive way? The third principle of Kingian Nonviolence says attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil, which I'm sure as a concept is not new to most people in this room. But in the Oscar Grant movement, we attacked the individual. We thought if Johannes Messerly would get locked up, that somehow police shootings would stop. And I always say if it weren't Johannes Messerly, it would have been another police officer. Right? If it weren't Oscar Grant, it would have been some other young black youth. These issues are not specific to any one individual, but we need to learn to build movements that acknowledges and honors our anger and that righteous indignation, and targets it at the root causes, at the conditions of why people are so violent, why communities struggle with injustice. Right? That anger is not a bad thing as long as we can channel it in the proper places. And we need to be angry at injustice. Now, I was mentioning that we hated Johannes Messerly, right? And I was talking about how when you hold on to that anger, it just eats you up from inside. And there's an old saying that says, hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? Like when you sit there, when you're just hating somebody and when you're just harboring that anger, the person you're angry at is probably having a wonderful day on their own. It does nothing to affect them, but it kills you inside, which speaks to the fifth principle of Kingian Nonviolence, which is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. That internal violence of that spirit, that emotional violence, like we think of all the homicides as being violent, and they are, but all of those homicides starts in here. Right? In fact, there's twice as many suicides every year in this country as there are homicides. So we have to acknowledge that violence isn't just a physical act, but it's oftentimes what we do to ourselves and what we do to each other without physical acts. Right? All the bullying that happens in schools, all the ways that we treat each other and the way that we misunderstand each other, the way that we oppress minority communities. We're not going in order, but we're talking about the six principles if you haven't noticed. The next moment in life that I just took a huge leap in terms of learning was after the Oscar Grant movement. It was the Occupy movement. And in the Occupy movement, I learned a considerable deal about principle number one, which is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And I learned a lot about that principle from the anarchists. And I had many, many heated debates and disagreement with many anarchist communities. I think we need to acknowledge that there are many anarchist communities that are committed to nonviolence. In fact, to me, the very idea of violence is, it goes against the principles of anarchy for me. Because anarchy by nature is a hierarchical thing, right? Or violence by nature is a hierarchical thing. But even with the diversity of tactics advocates, right, I learned a lot from them about courage, because they are not afraid to put their bodies on the line. They are not afraid to get arrested. They are not afraid to get tear gassed. They are not afraid of confrontations with injustice. Oftentimes, again, that anger, their righteous indignation, is targeted in the wrong places, in my opinion. but they're not afraid to go out there. And it's a criticism that a lot of nonviolent activists oftentimes face, is that we spend too much time talking about compassion and we don't know how to harness our righteous indignation and have the courage to go out and hit the streets. And I think that's something that nonviolent movements can never lose. But it's also, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people, right? I learned that a great deal too, because even in nonviolent caucuses in Occupy, there was a lot of violence within the caucus in terms of how we treated each other and how we looked at people within the caucus and outside of the caucuses. Globe used to say that nonviolence isn't just a guide for our external direct actions, but it also has to be a moral guide for our internal interactions within each other, within our own movements. Nonviolence isn't something you clock out of, right? It's like, all right, I'm going to a protest, I'm going to be nonviolent for the next 3 hours, and then I'm going to punch out, and I'm back to myself, right? Nonviolence has to be a way of life. And I also thought a lot about the 99% framing and how brilliant it was in that it brought so many issues and so many communities together. And at the same time, I don't think it's a framing that King would have ultimately supported. You know, King used to say that the issue of segregation wasn't an issue between black people and white people, but it was an issue between justice and injustice. And I was saying during the Occupy movement that this issue isn't an issue between the 99% and the 1%, but it's an issue between 100% of humanity and injustice. It's about what's right and what's wrong. There are plenty of people in the 1% that supported the Occupy movement. There are plenty of people in the 99% that didn't support the Occupy movement, right? It's never as simple as saying these people are right and these people are wrong, but it's about being able to build movements that articulates the root of injustice and being able to target that as the enemy. Principle 4 of nonviolence is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. Gandhi used to say that nonviolence is about making your oppressor see the injustice of their ways through your suffering. So in essence, you're sacrificing your suffering to try to reach the moral conscience of the oppressor or of the general public. And in Occupy, I remember seeing, you remember the image of the students at UC Davis who were sitting there nonviolently as they were being pepper sprayed by it was like a fire extinguisher size canister of pepper spray. And I remember how the nation responded to that image. And then I remember how the nation responded to images coming out of Occupy Oakland, where I was active. Very different. When we're able to stay nonviolent in the face of police repression and state repression, it paints a very clear image of who's right and who's wrong. And that public narrative is one of the most important weapons in nonviolence. And when we aren't able to accept that suffering without retaliation, then we lose sight of the goal. And that narrative becomes very confusing for the public. And Dr. Lafayette always says that no revolution is possible without the active support, if not the sympathy of the majority. Another thing I learned a great deal in Occupy was the importance of negotiation. Occupy Oakland had a policy to not talk to the city of Oakland, which that wasn't sitting well with me. I learned through Kingian Nonviolence that the goal of direct action, again, is to give yourself leverage so you can negotiate and end up in reconciliation. And with all of these encampments, all of these direct actions that was part of the Occupy movement, we were creating so much pressure, right? So much pressure against certain institutions. And then by not negotiating, we were letting all that pressure go to waste. We weren't utilizing the pressure that we were creating. And so direct action is never a goal. That's a huge thing that I learned in Occupy. Now, another place that I've learned an incredible amount is the trainings and the workshops that we do in some of the county jails and the prisons in California. And depending on the institution, the workshops that we do are mandatory. So we start the workshop with some people who are clearly not happy to be there, and they really let us know it. One women's jail that we went to, a young woman came into our class and she's like, I don't have an anger problem. I don't need to be here. This is bull. I'm like, okay. So, good morning. But in that workshop, I didn't know this until the end, but at the very end of the 2 days, there were two women that shared a story with us. And one of them said that the two women in the classroom, they were beefing. They had a long-standing conflict with each other. And so when one of them walked into the room that morning and saw the other one, She was like, oh, I don't know if I can be in this room for the next 2 days with this girl. And she told us that she was so inspired by the first day of our workshop that night she actually went out and reached out to the other woman that she was in a conflict with, and they were able to reconcile. And during the closing circle of the workshop, they shared that story with us, and they embraced in a hug in the middle of the circle. And that was one of the most touching things that I've ever seen during any of our workshops, and that brings us back to the concept of reconciliation and the importance of reconciliation. And how do we build movements that end in reconciliation instead of further divisions and further escalated conflicts? How do we balance that outrage and that righteous indignation with the compassion that leads to the beloved community in a way that we still have the courage to demand justice, right? That righteous anger, that righteous indignation is what gives us the power to demand justice, and the compassion and the love is what gives us the power to lead to the beloved community. So how do we balance those two things? Anger and love, compassion and outrage can equally be incredibly powerful forces on their own. But if we can combine the two towards the goal of justice, that's a powerful movement. It's an incredibly powerful movement. Dr. King used to say that power without love is reckless and abusive. That love without power is sentimental and anemic. That power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So that's our charge, right? That's our challenge, is to build a movement that has the power that comes with that righteous indignation, the courage that comes with the righteous indignation, with the compassion of agapic love. Those are two difficult things to balance. It's things that King was incredible in being able to kind of touch both extremes at once. But that's our challenge. And I believe that if we can harness both, that outrage, the moral outrage, and the love and the compassion, with a deep commitment to the idea of shugyo, with a deep commitment to training, and the courage to demand justice, that we can build a truly powerful movement of nonviolent peace warriors that leads to the beloved community. So I want to end my comments here. Thank you very much for having me. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A, but thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor. Thank you.
I'll try to make this one brief. My partner and I, we all had these conversations. Thank you for breaking up in the middle and letting us talk to each other. We're supposed to be talking about cultural clashes. And what we ended up talking about was how both of us, being sort of well-mannered white males who both come from lower class backgrounds, kind of avoid clashes. And your presentation is a lot about your exciting life, but you also referred to being in movements where there's a lot of kind of unspoken things going on. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, how do you apply these nonviolent principles in ways when a lot of the middle class overlay on things is kind of like not allowing the issues to come up as clashes, mm-hmm. the microaggressions. For instance, if we talk about schools, and I work in schools, a lot of boys might be overtly bullying and hurting somebody, but girls are doing microaggressions. So that's a parallel there also. And some way meditation works into this for you, and I'm curious about that too.
Mm-hmm. Nonviolence isn't about not being violent, right? It's about taking a stand against violence. And part of that is about conflict and being able to walk through conflict confidently and not being afraid of conflict. Nonviolence is not about avoiding conflict. Dr. Lafayette says that Dr. King used to set up conflicts between his staff sometimes and just let them go at it. And he would just sit back and watch. because he could learn great deals from conflict. So I think one of our lessons that we always talk about in our trainings is that when there's conflict, you have to figure out some way to engage in that discussion, as difficult as it may be. Because the longer you hold on to it without it being spoken, the more it's going to start to hurt. Dr. King used to always describe the role of direct action as trying to dramatize an issue, because oftentimes the injustices that were in black communities weren't being spoken about, weren't being addressed, even in the progressive white community. So they used direct action as a way to bring those issues into the forefront and force society to deal with it. And so I think, that's one of the biggest misunderstandings of nonviolence is it's about being passive and peaceful. And sometimes in that we lose sight of the fact that it's really about learning how we can confront the conflict in our lives. And meditation, I've found that there's a lot of parallels between meditation and nonviolence. In fact, during the height of the Occupy movement, when we were running workshops every single weekend in Oakland, and we were actually having to turn people away, the East Bay Meditation Center became our biggest supporter, and they hosted all of our workshops for free. And so at some point, I decided to go to one of their workshops and just fell in love with meditation. And I think the idea of shugyo and that deep practice of doing something consistently, and also I look at some of the footage of the trainings that Jim Lawson was leading in Nashville when they were preparing for the lunch counter sit-ins, and they're just able to sit there as people are putting their cigarettes out on them and throwing pies and whatever in their face, and you can't tell me that wasn't meditation. That was deep meditative practice and training. And so I think whether it's about learning to control our own anger from our own personal conflicts in our own personal lives, or learning how not to react to violence when we're engaged in movement work, I think meditation is a really important tool.
He held it like a bottle. Yeah. This is a good segue. My question is about the communication that sort of has to happen between people that believe in diverse tactics or by any means necessary, and people that believe in nonviolence. And I think the trick is the word believe in right there. Mm-hmm. That's a problem right there. Because, people are like, violence is just wrong into the face of somebody who has the desire to express it violently. And they're like, that's just bullshit. This is, no one's going to listen to you if you're not aggressive or whatever. And it's like both sides are taking a position. Nobody's listening and nothing gets really communicated or felt within. So can you speak to how we can get beyond taking the positions and get to a way where we're actually hearing and we can transform each other?
Sure. I want to say two things that's specific to Occupy, and then I'll respond more in a broad sense. I think the first thing is to not have these discussions on Facebook. I don't know how many people here are on Facebook, but there were so many heated discussions about this issue and other issues that happened during the Occupy movement on Facebook. And, there's that statistic. It's like 80% of statistics are made up on the spot. So I don't know exactly how much of this is, but I heard once that 80% of communication is nonverbal. And again, I don't know what the percentage is, but I know that so much of communication is about tone and eye contact and all of these. You lose all of that when you're discussing things online. And I think there's something about hiding behind the screen on a keyboard that makes people say things that they wouldn't normally say to people face to face. And so I think it's really important that we learn to have these discussions in person. And also with Occupy, the General Assembly was never a place that was conducive to dialogue. General Assemblies look different in all regions, but in Oakland, you had 2 minutes. And you don't build consensus by speaking for 2 minutes. You don't learn about each other's value systems by speaking for 2 minutes. And so I think we need to figure out how to create spaces where we're really acknowledging and honoring the depth of the discussions that need to happen. On a more broad level, I think one thing we can do is to always make sure, like, even when I'm trying to de-escalate conflicts, oftentimes I get into it and I start yelling and I start raising my voice. And so I think it's really important to kind of check ourselves, because we can't control the other person's response to what we say, but we can control our own responses. And also just to, I mean, you kind of said it, like sometimes we get so stuck in our own ideology that we're not willing to challenge ourselves. And I think it's really important that even if you disagree with that other person, like in our workshop, we say that the other person's perspective in a conflict, even if you disagree with that perspective, and even if you think that perspective is, even if that perspective is wrong, it's still a part of the story. And if you can't learn to see things from that other person's perspective, you're not seeing the full story. And if you don't see the full story, then you're not going to figure out the best response to that conflict. And so I think it's really important for us to, even if that other person is wrong, to really try to see where they're coming from and start the conversation there. And also really identifying what you have in common first before engaging in discussions about where your differences are. I think in Occupy, we always started the discussion with debates versus trying to figure out what we have in common first, so we have that as an underlying foundation for that conversation. So when we get into those difficult conversations, we have some baseline level of trust that we're working from. So that was just a few things, a few thoughts.
Thank you, Kazu. We've learned a lot. We've learned a lot in our walks, and thank you for being with us in that walk, because I remember your young face.
I was
I
17
remember your young face.
when we met, when I
Yeah.
met these two. I had hair down to here.
And I think I had an afro and a beard. And and I'm from the South Bronx, and born in Cuba, raised in Harlem. So I wanted to dovetail with some of the things you said. Yes, I'm going to drink the Coke here now. And angry, I was so angry, I hated everybody. Oh man, I was so angry. Shooting every day, drugs, cousins, AIDS, bail bondsmen, dinner, crying, where do we get the money to get cousin out of jail, and so forth and so on. I was sharing with some things with Kazu about the 60s, that somehow Columbia happened, and I was at Columbia Congress of Racial Equality, James Farmer from Fellowship, even by Rustin. But then I had learned about the Jews, that they suffered too. It wasn't just me. And the Irish and the Italians and Sacco Vanzetti, man. Boy, everybody's getting beat up. So anyway, ended up in Chicago Convention in '68, then Berkeley. And who did I meet? Shlomo Kalbach, a rabbi singing songs and dancing. I mean, singing songs about a Baal Shem Tov, the good man. And then later on, in the 90s, I meet the Panzami Hoji, walk, dancing, music, jazz. There was something in this sound, and then walking in nature that sort of say, hey, okay, I can work with this violence, but I need this nature. Mother was somehow in this, the eagles when we walked in the sky, and the trees, and the people, and the flowers. I didn't see that in the housing project. And it's like a prison in a housing project. The cities is a prison. I just happened to see a gate that was open. And so I was a little brown boy looking for myself in the 60s too. I didn't have to use drugs. I mean, I was already a nutcase. So going back to you, Kazu, there is this working with this anger. I mean, I'm still working with it. I still see Afghanistan, Somalia, veterans coming back. They were my brothers and sisters who went to the war and came back messed up, and they black on black violence. So the rage is always here, but how do you deal with it? And it's almost like a manure or caca. And someone said you have to look at it. It's like an analysis and compost it. and then put it in the garden and do something with it. You know, I mean, some nice flowers. Shoni and I are talking about a flower garden now. But this stuff comes from in here. You feel this practice in here. And I thank you, because you said it so nicely. Thank you, Kasu.
Thank you.
And now we're going to start to talk a little bit about the 6 principles and the 6 steps of nonviolence, which is sometimes referred to as the will and the skill of nonviolence. And then we're going to break you all up into some small groups for more discussion.
So, yeah, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolence is a more difficult path and not for the weak of heart. Yeah, so you have to make a conscious choice not to do what we're taught to, which is to react back in an escalated way. And so could someone read to me the beloved community principle, number 2 in blue? You want to do it again? All right. The beloved community is the framework for the future. Once we have effed all the police and gotten rid of all of the nasty politicians, then what? What about a vision where we can reconcile and we don't have to topple and have a seesaw of power, and the solution isn't going around killing that side and everybody who belongs to that group, but is actually including, and our movement is built on a foundation and a framework of the kind of people we want to be, the kind of community that we want to be. That's a beloved community, and that's the kind of nonviolent movement that I think part of what King was talking about. The 3rd principle I'm just going to read is attack forces of evil, not persons doing it. So this goes off of principle number 2. We are definitely, when you are working in your garden and you're, when you see a weed, do you just snip it and you're like, cool, it's done? No, it grows back. So we obviously need to get at the root causes of what's happening. And with the police oppressing people, I see that as the manifestations of a deeper problem. And even if one individual is acting in a horrible way, if they're a genocidal dictator, they themselves, removing Osama bin Laden, removing one person or the people who follow them, it's much more effective to address the causes, not the people. So Mary Lou is going to talk about the next 3 principles.
Thank you, Kaylee. Okay, would somebody like to read number 4? Thank you, thank you. Accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. Okay, so this morning Kazu spoke about the people who were involved in the lunch counter sit-ins in the 60s who were trying to integrate the lunch counters. And when they were accosted by the local people, they were beaten, sometimes punched, sometimes burned. They sat there with their own quiet dignity and stayed. And it was that dignity that they kept that we remember. That was a kind of example of dramatic kind of accepting suffering for the sake of the cause. We all know stories of civil disobedience. Many people here have been arrested for some kind of cause that they felt was really important. We go back to the civil rights movement days, the Freedom Riders who were trying to integrate the buses in the South. Many of them got arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, and ended up in Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi for a long time. People are still getting arrested. It's a way of making a powerful statement, saying, this is something I'm really serious about. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Number 5, who could read this for me? Avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external violence. So we talked a little bit about what that internal violence of the spirit is, sometimes I think of it as like emotional violence. You know, when we talk about abuse, we talk about physical abuse and emotional abuse. And sometimes it's a kind of, it can also be emotionally abusing other people, feeling nasty things about them, negative things about them, that it's very easy to feel and be so angry, whether it's the police or other people who are like the people who started with the wars that we feel so angry about.
Focus on what
Yes. So it's so important to be able to keep the focus. So in some sense, it's a practical matter. It helps the movement if you can avoid that kind of internal violence, because otherwise it's like if somebody throws a rock in a demonstration, the news is about the rock. It's not about the cause, and that's that kind of way. It's very distracting. Who can read number 6 for me? Okay? Thank you. Comments on this one. The universe is on the side of justice. Okay? So we feel agitated when we're aware of injustice, and that's what, you know, I just feel like there's something in our human nature that wants things to be fair and wants things to be just. You know, we know when we're all kids are really concerned about what's fair, you know, and we argue over whether this is fair or not fair, but everybody cares about whether it's fair.
I think the universe gives back what you give it. So, like, if you treat people badly, you'll be treated badly in return. It's kind of like that.
So, I'm going to run through this quickly because what we want to do next is break you all up into groups so that you guys can continue some discussion around the principles. But this is what we call the 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence. It's how we take all the principles, all the studies on conflict that we learned throughout the workshop and apply them into an organizing campaign or even into our own personal life. The first step is information gathering. When I was part of the Oscar Grant movement, there was a BART board meeting, the board of the BART, which is the transit system, and we packed that boardroom, filled with people. We all had our picket signs and everything, and we had a list of demands. And one of our demands was that they fire the chief of police who was on duty the night that Oscar Grant was killed. So we were in the room, we jam-packed it, we're making all this noise, and later on we found out that the BART board of directors didn't have the authority to fire the chief of police even if they had wanted to. And so because we didn't spend the time to gather that information first, we ended up looking kind of silly, right? And so often when there's instances of injustice, we jump straight to the protest, and we don't gather the necessary information. One of the things we talk about in Kingian Nonviolence is that all conflict has history. So when Oscar Grant got shot that night, that wasn't a conflict that started on that platform. But we have to look at the history of police brutality. We have to look at the history between communities of color and the police. We have to look at the history of how the media portrays young black people. All of that contributed to that incident that happened on that one night. So part of the information you need to gather is the history of whatever conflict you're studying. You also need to gather information about the conflict from all of the different perspectives, right? If it was Oscar Grant, from the community's perspective, from the police's perspective. All the perspectives are important. Once you gather that information, you need to put that information in formation so that you can go and educate your community. Make sense? So if you're going to educate young people, you might want to take all that information, that data that you gathered, and create a youth workshop so that you can go to young people and engage them and educate them about that issue. If you're going to talk to a group of lawyers, you may want to put that information in a little bit of a different formation so that they can really understand the message. So you have to identify all of the communities that you want on your side and figure out the best way to educate that community so that you're developing leaders in all of the different communities that can speak to your issue. Once you educate that community, now, for all the young people in the room, you all know about the Montgomery bus boycott? Oh, yes. Yeah? Do any of the young people know how long the Montgomery bus boycott lasted? 381 days. And a lot of people don't know that. And that's the level of commitment that they had to their struggle, right? They were willing to walk to work for an entire year, and even more than a year, every single day in the rain and in the cold, and they walked to work. And sometimes, you know, we're only committed to a one-day protest. Like, I'll commit to coming to a protest for a day, and then after that day, I'm just going to go back to living my normal life. So we need to be committed long-term to that struggle. Once you've gathered that information, once you've educated your community, developed leaders, now you have a sense of how long your campaign might take. And you need to develop leaders that are committed to the long-term struggle. Now, there's another piece of this personal commitment part, and you brought it up with the importance of music and the importance of song. In the civil rights movement, when they sang freedom songs, it wasn't just something they were doing to kill time, right? It was something that they were doing to feed their spirits. And without those songs, it's really important to get bitter, because movement work is really difficult, and it's really easy to lose your commitment to the struggle and become bitter. So whether it's singing songs or poetry or meditation or whatever it is, as movement leaders, we need to make sure that we're designing activities as a core part of the movement that keeps people's spirits lifted and that keeps people personally committed to the cause. Once you've done that, you move on to negotiation. Even in a war, in an all-out armed conflict, that conflict is resolved when the two sides finally decide to come together and talk over a table. Negotiation, dialogue is where all conflict is resolved. But in Kingian nonviolence, we believe that, first of all, in negotiation, we have to find a win-win solution, right? Because when you're negotiating, what happens when one side gets everything that they want and the other side gets nothing? Is the conflict really reconciled? Oh, because the person that lost everything is going to want to come back and get more the next opportunity that they can. So you have to find solutions where both sides feel like they gain something. In Kingian Nonviolence, we also believe that only equals can negotiate. Because if one side has more power and more authority than the other, they can refuse to negotiate with you, or they can sit at the table and say, okay, we've heard all your concerns and we don't really care. This negotiation, this conversation is over. Right? So only equals can negotiate. And when there's a power imbalance, when one side refuses to negotiate with you or refuses to have a genuine negotiation, that's when we move on to step 5, direct action. Now, this was a crazy thing that I learned when I was first going through this workshop, is of all the 6 steps, direct action is actually the only one that's not a necessary component to a campaign. Because if you can resolve your issue by talking about it, there's no need to move to a protest. But oftentimes, all we think of is the protest. But a direct action is something you use to give yourself leverage so you can go back to the negotiating table as equals. Right? If your mayor refuses to meet with you, maybe if you get 5,000 people to sit out in front of their office, maybe then they'll meet with you. Right? You're giving yourself leverage, but the goal is to give yourself leverage so you can always go back to that negotiating table where conflict is resolved. So you use the direct action. You go back to the negotiating table. Once you found that win-win solution, we move on to the 6th and necessary critical step of reconciliation. Some people sometimes think that you resolve a conflict by splitting 2 people that are fighting and say, you walk that way, you walk that way. All right, now they're not fighting anymore, so the conflict is resolved, right? What happens when those 2 people see each other on the other side of the street? It's on again, right? Or sometimes they might not even see each other, but they're going to take that anger that's still alive in them and take it out on somebody else. So conflict reconciliation isn't about separating 2 people in a party, but it's about bringing folks together so that we can walk away as equals, recognizing that we both gain something out of that reconciliation, out of that negotiation, so that the conflict is officially neutralized. There's no longer any lingering bad feelings, and that's when you can really take one step closer to the beloved community. All right? Any questions on the 6 steps? I know I went through it really, really quickly, but...